Let me just read you one of
I
my
love
favorite
that.
quotes along these lines. This is from a Latina woman. And I asked her why she hopes. And first she says, Jesus is the center of my hope. But then she took a breath and launched into this rolling rhythm of like a preacher. And she says this, my hope is in knowing the promises that come afterwards, that we live by faith and not by sight. And we claim things that even though we don't see them yet, we're trusting. We're trusting that God is going to call people from every tribe and tongue and nation, that this will happen. My hope can't be on the leadership of my church. My hope can't be on the people at my church. My hope can't be on the politicians. My hope can't even be on myself because we are all so fallen. My hope has to remain consistently on Jesus, who is the author, the finisher of all this. He will perfect us. We are in progress.
Well, hey there, guys. Welcome to another episode of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I am your faithful host, Josh Burtram, and our political host is not able to be with us today. But as always, make sure you guys are liking, subscribing, sharing, do the things that keeps bringing these honest, thoughtful conversations that are actually useful. Guys, make sure you're doing that. And here we love to live at the intersection of faith and public life. We don't want slogans. What we try to do is slow down and figure out what is going on in America with faith and politics. And today I'm joined by Dr. Christine Jeske. She's an associate professor of anthropology at Wheaton College, and she studies how people change over time, what forms them, what sustains them, and what makes change stick, even when life gets complicated. Her new book is Racial Justice for the Long Haul, How White Christian Advocates Persevere and Why. And we are excited to talk to her about that book today. Dr. Jeske, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to talk with you and your listeners.
Yes, absolutely. So I got to ask just from the beginning, what is the basic for our audience? What's the basic thesis of this book? Why are you talking about racial justice for the long haul? I thought we had a bunch of racial justice in our society. I'm kind of taking on the view of some people might be looking and saying, aren't we past this race stuff? Why'd you write the book? What's the
Right.
basic
That's a
thesis?
great question. Let's dive in. So I teach at Wheaton College. I teach anthropology, which is a subject I came into kind of later in life. And for those who have not heard of anthropology, I'll just start there too. It's a way of studying people and culture that for me usually involves interviewing people and hanging out with people and looking for patterns across what they do. And I'd done some research on how people handle unemployment and oddly enough, some research on like how people think about killing meat animals. Like you can study anything with anthropology.
It's pretty
But
amazing.
I teach at a Christian college that's predominantly white, and I teach about race in so many of my classes. And I
Interesting.
hit this point of realizing, I teach about this, but it's also an issue that has moral implications. And I wanted to know, do my students just sort of like learn a few facts about history and move on with their life? Or does it somehow actually lead to meaningful change in how we engage with the world as Christians? And I didn't know. And there's a lot of books that tell people about the history of racism and have some steps of what you can do to get started doing something about it. But what I couldn't find is somebody who'd actually researched what does it look like to do this for the long term? How do you work toward a society that is better for everybody in a way that's sustainable and consistent and also do it as a Christian? And to understand that, I was like, I got to talk to some Christians. So I talked to people of color first who were leaders in churches and asked them, what does racial justice mean to you? And how do you see that playing out in your life and in the people around you? And then I asked them, do you know white people who are doing this also? Because the thing about race is like it affects us differently. And so as white people, it's easier to not think about it. And I wanted to find the people who actually choose to think about it. And so those were the people who were recommended by other people in their life who are people of color. And together I interviewed 70 people. And the book is basically like, what is consistent across their lives? How do they do what they do? What do they do? What are they working for? And we can dive into that.
I love that. So, when you were doing the research for this book, did you find that the bottleneck when it came to race, like, because you're mentioning certain people did think about it, right? They were intentional about it, right? People of color thought about it automatically almost. It was very difficult not to think about it. Just correct me if I'm wrong, right, in anything
Good.
that
Yep.
you're saying. But do you think that the bottleneck is a lack of awareness?
Mm.
Is it a lack like of agreement that we just can't agree on what race is or that race is a problem? Is it a lack of just perseverance? People are just tired of the same things coming up again and again and not knowing what to do? Or was there something different or none of these and it just we don't really know what the bottleneck is? What do you think?
That's a great question. I think as a professor, often my job had involved teaching people to think differently. You could just get information, like you said, kind of like awareness. And there's a lot of research, including my research, that has found that actually just having information is not enough. And you can have a lot of information, but you can choose to do what you want with your information. You can block out information. You can, kind of tuck it away in another category, right? And so I use this framework to explain what I saw of it engages heart and mind and soul and strength. And we as Christians know, like when Jesus was asked to say, what is the greatest commandment? He's loved, like, this idea of the Shema from the Old Testament, which is love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And then he says, loving your neighbor is the second commandment and it's like it. And so I think about how loving our neighbor means also engaging heart and soul and mind and strength. And I found that kind of after I'd already written half the book and I'd written an outline for it. And I was like, oh my goodness, this kind of explains what I'm seeing. So, there's these different steps that I think rotate through our lives and repeat over and over again. But I think God challenges us to love our neighbor through those 4 different ways. There's like moments that engage the heart where all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, I'm like emotionally hit, like cut to the knife. I saw, this thing happen to my friend and I can't ignore that it's terrible. There's that, but there's also mind where like you have to step back and understand, why did this happen? Ask some questions. Why
Yes,
is
I
this
like that.
happening? And then there's the soul question, which is like, how do you repair harm? How do you receive forgiveness? How do you respond to forgiveness? How does our relationship with God enter into this process too? And then there's the strength, which, if you actually go back to the Hebrew, like these are not exactly what all these terms mean, right? But using it
Sure.
loosely,
Yeah.
I think of strength as like, it actually involves getting busy and doing something. Like you have to actually not just think about it, not just feel something, but like in this material world we're part of, go do things. Yeah.
I really love the framework. I mean, it's a very helpful framework to think about when it's from Jesus. So that's nice, right? Yeah, that biblical part of it, all your heart, soul, mind, strength, right? We can look at that, but it does give us nice categories, right? That were categories of the ancient mind and how they kind of saw the world. And I think they're helpful for us. I do really like that. Trying to connect people. It's super helpful to think about that as almost like a thinking tool to work through how I'm going to feel, how I'm like the questions I'm going to ask, causal questions, thinking about this, how I'm going to kind of work through the spiritual aspect of this right now and what this means for my spiritual practices and how I'm going to endure as I'm doing this. Like you said, like having that strength to keep going. And it's not just a physical strength. It is an emotional strength, right? It is a strength of the will. I love one of the things that you do, and you identify a 3-part pattern. Right? It's collisions, asking why, responding to grace. I would love for you to kind of give a simple definition of what those are for our audience. Again, collisions, asking why, responding to grace. And what do you think gets misunderstood about these?
Yeah.
Or maybe the danger. What are they in danger of being misunderstood as?
That's a great way to walk you through this book. Yeah. So a collision, I say it's when your imagination of how the world works collides and clashes so starkly with reality that you can't ignore it. And we have all had moments like this, and not just about like racial injustice, but all kinds of things, right? Where you're like, I didn't think it was going to happen like that, but
it's a collision. It's just it hit me.
Yeah. Like, you might know somebody who has an addiction and you're like, whoa, I thought we could just, talk that through and be done. And it's not done. Or, I talk about there's all kinds of big problems that we face that are like racial injustice. And so like, if you faced a big problem, you can compare a lot of this to that. A collision is that moment where it just hits you in the face and you can't ignore it. And that often engages your heart. For many people, there's like news stories that you can point to that were like that. 2020, a lot of people watched the news about George Floyd engaged in a demonstration or something like that. And they had this moment of like, whoa, we cannot just let this slide by as a community. So there's collisions. The danger in that is it might just engage your heart for a short little moment and you let it go by and don't do anything about it. So the second piece that I noticed consistently across people who are doing this for the long term is asking why. And this is like, we use the term in social sciences a lot of times like structures and systems. And maybe for some listeners is like, I don't know, that feels kind of cringy. I don't know if that's what I'm looking
Hmm.
for. But like what we're talking about there is just basically like, how does society work together? It's saying like,
Hmm.
not just who am I as a member of my church, but like, how is my church set up? Or how is my neighborhood set up? And why is it set up that way? Like what happened historically that it turned out that way and not another way? Like, I mean, let me tell a story just to fit this into
Please.
some details. So let me start with this one. There's a man who grew up in an urban area and his neighborhood was predominantly white. And he kind of knew like there's some neighborhoods you don't go into and you just kind of hear these messages growing up, right? And he's like the words we use for those neighborhoods were not necessarily like black or Hispanic or like race related terms. They were words more like sketchy or like dangerous, you know? And he
Right,
just
right,
kind of
right.
didn't go there. And then he was in college and just kind of out of curiosity one day, he went for a walk and got to this corner that he knew was like a border between those neighborhoods. And he paused and he walked into a gas station and he bought a Gatorade and he walked out. And there's this man there who turned out to be Hispanic and was welcoming a conversation with him. And they just stood there and he talked while he drank this Gatorade. And this man starts telling him about like how he came to this country and what immigration meant to him and like poverty that he'd grown up in and like dangers that his family had faced. And he starts telling him about his life. And, this guy from the white side of the city was like, how did I not know what was going on like blocks away from my house? And that was like a collision moment for him. Now, he could have just been like, well, that's interesting, and walked home. But this man actually invited him to come to his apartment and visit later. And he said yes.
Hmm.
And he came back and he met
Hmm.
him. And then he starts asking more people from that neighborhood to talk. And he starts just like having conversations left and right about stuff he'd never talked about before. So that's the asking why process. Now, the third thing I say was consistent across people is responding to grace. And as Christians, like we know grace is basic to our faith. We have to do grace, right? But I think in the realm of racism, we sometimes interpret race in a couple of different problematic ways. One is a direction that makes grace too easy, where we're like, well, there was a racist thing that happened and that's too bad, but the people who are affected by it should just forgive. Like, just get over it, just give some grace. Why don't you just give a little more grace, And there's an expectation from some people sometimes of like, well, you give grace and then it's done and you don't have to think about it anymore. The other side of it, and I think this is the side that liberals tend towards. So I think the conservatives, just like this is a blanket statement and you can, well, we can unpack it. But I think that often conservatives tend toward wanting an easy grace in terms of racism. And I think liberals tend
Hmm.
toward wanting a really hard grace where it's like, don't ever ask anybody to forgive because that's too much pressure on people of
Right.
color. And just kind of keep working at it forever and kind of always live in guilt and shame if you're white. And that's not helpful either. So Christian grace, like
Yeah.
actually, when we really dig into the theology of it, it provides this way through that is absolutely necessary, but really hard.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like, obviously, it's funny because my co-host is, his dad is black, his mom is Asian. She's from Vietnam. And it would be interesting to hear his take on this. He was going to be able to make it, but he couldn't. But I just like, I think about how, from my perspective as a white man, I want to be someone who understands the racial issues. This has been a process, though, to me to get to this point, to understand the racial issues and to be able to connect to people about it in an empathetic way and not jump to conclusions and not feel defensive. I mean, it took a very long time, like the word white privilege, despite, again, this isn't an endorsement of that term or not an endorsement of the term. It's an example. It's the term white privilege, just as an example. It took me a long time before I could hear that without feeling very defensive. And even hearing it now, I still feel a little bit defensive, even though I understand the concept, even though, kind of makes sense to me, quite a lot of it. I'm not fully on board with everything. And so that's kind of why I'm careful about that, because then people hear one thing and then they assume all sorts of things about what I think that I'm not actually saying. So please don't do that. I'm just saying that
Let's all not do that, right?
Yeah. What I'm doing, the example I'm trying to bring out is that when we look at something like this, like, I didn't feel racist. I was born in 1985. My parents never taught me, like, explicitly, certainly, or anything that people of another race were worse or anything, like, never. I mean, not even close, but we're all equal, all of that. And I grew up in a diverse place, and I still had that maybe fear. I still had that, yeah, just that sense of offense when I would hear that term. And I'm thinking about this, and when I hear that, it's like I do think that the grace should be shared. It's hard because on the one sense, you do understand why people of color would feel that way. It's like we've been living with this. You don't get it. You refuse to get it. It seems like, and I'm just tired. I don't even want to deal with this.
Yeah.
That kind of actually makes sense to me. Definitely. I think though, like, that doesn't change the reality though. I think of what some people would say, well, hey, I'm trying, and if no one's going to have grace, or they feel like I should feel guilty about being white or whatever it is, I'm just not going to do that. Like, whether or not I should or shouldn't, I'm not going to, because I'm not going to live my life that way. And I was born in 1985. I never did anything to anybody of color. And there's so many arguments that could come into why I'm privileged and all that. And I get it. And I'm actually willing to talk about any of that stuff. But it's actually dealing though with how people actually think, feel, and live their lives. And that's what you have to do. You have to reach people and come to people where they are.
Yeah.
Not where you wish they were, not where they should ideally be, but where they are right at this moment.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about this idea. Well, let me pause here and give you a chance to reflect if you want on anything I said.
I'll just say, I think the one thing that came through really clear through talking to all these people is that it's a journey, and it's a long journey, and none of us are exactly where somebody else is on the journey. Sometimes our default is to, like, assume that everybody else needs to hear exactly the same thing that we needed to hear yesterday or today or something. And, like, different people need to hear different things along their journey. That's not to say, like, there's no truth to it, or, like, we can all have whatever opinions we want to. But we're just different places in this growth process. It's kind of like learning how to drive. Like, some people are just sitting in the car for the first time and terrified because somebody they knew died in a car accident. And, like, other people are like, I've been doing this for a long time and I need to, like, go to the next level.
Right.
Yeah, like that, even that's like grace. So we need to extend to each other too, and extend to ourselves. And we're not going to get it all right the first time. Yeah.
Yeah, we absolutely do have to extend that grace. Now, I want to jump back to this idea of collisions, because I think it's so important, because I think that's the starting point, right? And all of us have these collisions in our lives at some point. We usually will, if not in actual IRL, in real life. That's what my son says. In real life, as opposed to online. If it's not in real life, it is online. That we're going to have something that hits us, and there's this shocking moment or collision moment, something where, man, what we were told, what Aunt Jenny told me growing up, maybe that's not, and Dad told me there's someone that thinks differently, and man, this is hitting me hard. So I want to move into this, because those are profound moments, and they can almost be like, I think, maybe that's too strong of a word, but they can, maybe tend to push us towards feeling like that's enough, right? Like, hey, I felt that thing. Hey, I'm a compassionate person. I've thought about this. I think about that and I feel compassion. I mean, after all, like, we were never supposed to see all these news stories, right? What can I do about what's happening in Iran? What can I do about what's happening in Jerusalem? What can I do about even what's happening in California or Minneapolis? I'm here. Right. So a lot of people might think that way. Why are collisions necessary but insufficient?
Yeah,
What
great.
do they actually produce? What do they fail to produce
Hmm.
on their own?
Yeah. Let me give you another example from my own life. So, as a social scientist, I really wanted people like take this seriously as research because there's one thing with like writing a memoir that's your own story, but it's
Sure,
different to
right.
look at like 70 different people's lives and see what
Absolutely.
is actually in common across those. And so I was hesitant to even include stories from my own life and I thought really hard about like how much to put in, but I ended up putting it in the epilogue because I was like I think readers deserve to know why did I end up writing this story too?
That makes sense.
And for me, this experience of research was really helpful to, like, figure out, like, that's what I was going through at that season of my life. So let me give you one example from when I was in college. I had grown up in a predominantly white family, predominantly white neighborhood, school, city, everything, and so I like you, I think I didn't know that I had could do anything wrong. I was like, "Well, I don't have anything against anybody, I'm fine," right?
Right,
And
right,
so
right,
then I
right.
get to college and I was a junior and I was an RA in the dorm. So I'm overseeing a group of about 50 women who lived in this floor. And we were several weeks into the semester, and I get this knock on my door. And this Black woman comes in who's on my floor and she says, "Look, I grew up in a city that was like 99% Black. I haven't been around white people that much, but you know what? This is weird." And she said, "I have a white roommate and she's nice to me to my face, but whenever she, like, goes to dinner, she doesn't invite me, and she assumes that I'm only friends with the other Black people on this floor, which is, like, 5 of
Hmm.
us, and I don't know what to do about that." And she's, like, in tears, and I'm thinking, "I don't know what to do about that either." Like, I don't know. I'm not trained for this. And,
Yes.
there's that, which it was like, okay, so like this is roommate problems, like, give them a little bit of some ideas. And then a few weeks later, I get home from being gone from a weekend and I get a knock on my door again. And a student says, "Did you hear what happened between these other two roommates who are also a Black and white roommate pair?" And they say the white roommate's parents came for the weekend and took masking tape and made a line down the middle of the floor in this dorm room and
What?
shouted at the Black roommate, "You will not cross
What?
over this line." They accused her of stealing stuff, which came out she had
What?
not done. And it was like, whoa, we have recreated segregation right
My
here
gosh,
in our
dude.
dorm. And I don't think these parents really even realize what they're doing. I'm
My
sure they
gosh,
probably were
dude.
like, "This is not about Black and white. This is just about them not getting along." But not realizing like that is really significant to these roommates. So these things are happening. And
Right.
later in the year, a white roommate throws her Black roommate's television across the room. Like all of a sudden, I have to
My
face the
gosh.
fact that like none of these explicitly, I mean, the first one, she knew there was race involved, but some of them didn't know whether race was involved, but
Right,
it's
right,
like
right.
it's happening. Um, so, I could have been like, well, I made it through the year and everybody got along and nobody hurt anybody. Like, too bad, right? I could just like
Right, right,
get
right, right,
through
right.
that year. But instead, it sent me into wanting to understand what else could be done about this. And that's where like complicity comes in there too, is like I could tell this story in a way to be like, well, it wasn't my fault. I wasn't one of
Of
those roommates.
course.
I didn't throw a television. But there's also complicity and I didn't know. I had not been in circles where I'd learned what to do about this and I wasn't able to like contribute positively to it. Like I think as Christians we believe like we're supposed to actively move toward the suffering and the hurt and find out how do we help be a part of healing and that's what comes kind of after collision moments.
I really love that because it's like the collision moment brings you into this new reality, right? I mean, you're essentially colliding with a new reality,
Yeah.
something you didn't expect. And now you're left to think like, okay, I can't unsee that. I can't undo that. Now I got to live with whatever just happened or the
Yeah.
implications of what just happened. And it's interesting to me because we're really dealing with, at least so it seems to me, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this as an anthropologist, but it seems to me like there is reality in the sense that like, let me see if I can explain this. All right, let me do a little bit of story and then it'll I think it'll make sense. So I was at a previous church that I worked at. We went through a lot of training on like white privilege and racism stuff. It was very rare for church to do that, and we did. And I remember we were going through a book together as a staff, and we had no one of of color on the staff. And, but we were going through a book about race, and we had several people, there was some diversity in the church along those lines. And so we were working through this, and I just remember so many, like several people, some of my colleagues were like really upset by the material. And they would not have considered themselves racist, and I didn't really consider them racist, but they're very upset by the material. And they would start bringing things like data. Well, don't you know, like this is what the data says about cops and arrests and shootings and and all that stuff. And I remember saying, just kind of interjecting one time, saying, I don't know what the data is, and I understand there's questions about that. I understand you can look at raw statistics and you try to understand a picture of that, and sometimes that can look different than what you might hear from someone on an anecdotal level, right? So we always have to be careful. And I do think that entire categories of people can take on some kind of thing that becomes either a lie or a myth or something. It happens in societies all the time. Again, you're an anthropologist. I'm sure you know better than I do how that happens. So what's in all of this, right? I said, I understand that, all this data is out there, but the reality is that these people that we know and love, this is what they feel like is happening. This is their reality, whether we think that it is or not, whether it's our reality. And maybe we should have some humility and say, maybe my reality doesn't define it, right? But it gets to this point of when people get hit with some collision and they either go in the right way, it builds curiosity or it breeds defensiveness, right? Go ahead. Go ahead. You can respond.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll say about collisions too that I thought was really interesting when I started looking at how people talked about this was I asked people of color to kind of describe their life too, like how they came to be a person who cared about racial justice also, because being a person of color doesn't mean you're like born understanding how society works or
Right.
thinking about racism. And they would tell stories too that were about collisions. But I noticed when they told stories, it was often like that happened so often. Like it was the frequency of it that was just unrelenting. And they had to think about it because it kept happening. Case in point, this floor that I was on as an RA, I actually go to a church now where I discovered one of the people who was on that floor is going to this church. She's a Black woman. And I brought this up and I told her some of these stories and she's like, yeah, I'm not sure, like, that I even remember that because I remember a lot of things like that happening. Like, it was like that was so common that she almost didn't remember the specifics of it. Whereas for me, as a white person,
it was such a big deal.
It was such a big deal. Yeah. And when white people talk about these, it's often like, how did I get to this point in my life and not know this was happening? And so it's like the shock of it being so rare. How did I avoid this?
Yeah, I do agree with that.
Yeah. And so I think like there's humility and there's like empathy and just being, like you said, willing to say, the way I experience the world is not necessarily what other people are experiencing, and I need to take seriously what they're experiencing. What is a pattern that they're a part of when I'm a part of a different kind of a pattern in society?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to think about how much we have in common with people and a shared experience of life. Like we're human, we have the same kind of emotions and needs and all that. And that brings our humanity, right? Because we have to treat other people like humans. And that's part of empathy. Like, I'm not empathizing with my dog like I'm empathizing with my kids or my wife and I don't think I should, right? There's something about that shared humanity. And yet at the same time, I think we can collapse and flatten these differences that are so significant. So significant, especially in communication and expectation, that they can really create problems when you ignore it. And they can really create miscommunication, which then creates offense just miscommunication is an issue, whether offense is involved or not, just because actual communication isn't happening. And so it can really complicate things. And I think, it makes sense why then this next logical step is to ask why, asking a lot of why. What kind of why questions, though? Because are all why questions created equal? I know when I would always say, or people say, there are no dumb questions. Is that really true? And are all why questions created equal? Meaning, do some deepen your understanding of this better? Questions about history, questions about institutions, questions about, incentives, whatever. Or are there some that are better than others, I guess?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've never been asked, but I think I encourage students to ask a lot of questions. I don't know if there's better and worse questions, but I will say there are some questions that you got to be warned beforehand that you might ask a question that betrays your ignorance and and you gotta
For
be ready
sure.
to deal with that. And also in betraying that ignorance, I think sometimes it can be exhausting to the person that you're asking it of if they have had to know that the answer to that question, like for their survival for a very long time. An example being one of the men who was part of this study, a white man, was telling a story of a collision moment that he had happen, which was when I can't even remember exactly what the event was, but it was a news story that was unfolding that very much was, it might have been the LA riots, but it was very much affecting Black people. And
Hmm.
whatever the news story was, like he was in a room with a Black person who was like watching this unfold on the news. And his question was something along the lines of like, well, why do you care? Why does this matter? That's asking why. And like at some point you got to ask those questions and learn. But for the person being asked that question, they're like, how can you not see that it matters? Like this matters so deeply to my community because this
Right.
means like we could be unsafe tomorrow. Like police might be coming for us. We might not be able to walk home in the dark. Like it means so much
Yes.
to some people that the question itself can feel offensive. That's part of where grace comes in. It's like it takes grace for someone sometimes to pause and explain it to you when you don't get it. And when somebody does, like just receive that as a gift.
Hmm.
Don't be like, I don't think that's true. I'm going to bring in my dad. I don't believe you. Thank them for taking time to explain something to you. If it's about their life and it's important to them, be gracious about it and receive it with grace. But what kinds of questions? I talk about questions about culture, like what happens in cultural differences. Like some of the hurt that happens around race just comes down to people having different cultural ways of being in the world and not understanding each other. But also questions about structure. And by that, I mean like how institutions work. Like what I said, it's not just who I am as a church member, but what is my church? How's my church set up? And third, I say questions about morality. Like what should we do?
Hmm.
As Christians, what responsibility do we have to care for our brothers and sisters around the world?
The- I really, really like that. I love those questions. I think they're super important. Absolutely. When you're thinking about when you're doing these interviews, what caused people to drop out after
Yeah.
they learned? What was kind of the turning point maybe where people would kind of quietly just disengage?
Yeah, several things. But I realized pretty early on in this research that hope was something I needed to pay attention to. When I asked white people, like, how are you different from what you were like when you first started in this work or in this process? Sometimes they would say flat out, like, I just hope differently. And I'd be like, what does that mean? And people often were like, I've never been asked that. I don't know what I mean by that, but I know I hope differently. And I think hope is like a kind of pivot point for a lot of this is how do you hope? I think people often come in with a hope that I call delusional hope. It's like, we think it's going to be easy. We can get over this. Like, I'll show up to volunteer a couple times a month and we're going to be good.
Hmm.
It's going to make it, everything's going to be fine. And then they realize like it's difficult. And the thing about collisions and asking why is both of them are kind of kicking out that delusional hope. You can no longer just be optimistic and naive and think that things are going to be easy and that things will kind of basically stay the same in the world, but we'll just keep doing more of what we're doing and then there won't be racism one day. You start to realize it's going to take active work and I don't know if we can make it work. It might be too hard for us. What happens then? So I talk about like pitfalls to perseverance, moments or like situations we run into where we just want to give up on perseverance. One of them is
Yes.
like just uncertainty around complexity, realizing this is
Mm.
complicated. I've been asking why for a couple years. I've read a couple books, I'm like, it's still
Yeah, I thought I'd be done
complicated.
by now.
Yeah. Here's an example of that. I had this guy who spent a whole summer while he was in college volunteering or just after college volunteering in an urban area that was predominantly non-white. He's a white man and kind of felt like he was learning a lot about the history of racism and redlining and Jim Crow and like how did this community become the way that it is, impoverished and under-resourced, and felt good about himself. And then he's like in his last week and somebody mentions to him like, I can't believe you could spend a whole summer volunteering and not getting paid. You are so privileged. And like, it just hit him. He's like, this very thing that I thought I was doing that was so good is also like setting me apart from everybody I'm trying to volunteer from. And like, is there any hope of like bridging those divides? How do you try to help but not be like the white savior, if we use that term, right? Like you think you can make everything better on your own. So there's these like complexities you run into. One of them is also just like fear of guilt. You don't want to have to make mistakes along the way. And it's easy to like sit on the sidelines and be around people of your same race. But often, if we're trying to solve racism, that means being around people of different races from ourselves. And that gets harder. Like, we're going to make mistakes in those settings. We're going to hurt people and be hurt ourselves. So there's a lot of reasons people would rather just walk away from it.
And that makes sense. It brings up so many scenarios. There was this time back in when everything with George Floyd happened, and I posted something, and I was waiting as a conservative or someone who identified as conservative. I had a lot of angst about using the phrase Black Lives Matter, not because I don't believe that, and I would have said that at the time as well. I never have thought that Black lives don't matter, but it was feeling like if I said that, I would be categorized as a certain thing, woke, and then maybe I could lose funding, or people wouldn't like this. Like, this is the reality I live in, right? That certain people will see that, and I have had people do that, like
Yeah.
leave because of my views
Yeah.
and stop funding, stop helping. And so those are all real costs. But I remember posting this and then getting from somebody that I respected and cared for. They weren't super close friends, but definitely knew them and respected them. And they got really offended by it. Well, I don't want to say they were upset by something that I said in this post. And I remember thinking, is this even worth it? Like, I'm trying to do something that's actually a risk for me. It's actually going to cost me. And maybe it's not enough to whoever person X, Y, or Z that looks at it and says, wow, you think that's bad. Look at what I've had to do or how I've had to suffer. And I totally grant that. I'm not saying it's equivalent, but it is my reality, right? And my incentives that I have to deal with. And so I'm doing I'm trying to take a step, and then I feel like I get the very people I'm trying to reach out to, I get kind of bit, right?
Yeah.
By it. Or like, not bit, that's not the right word, but like, I'm not trying to imply anything. You get hurt by it. And there was a misunderstanding, miscommunication, right? I tried to explain it, and actually things are much better. But I just remember thinking, should I even do this?
Yeah.
Why even care? And I've continued, though, thankfully, and I'm so thankful for the relationships I have with particularly Black friends, that I've developed some very close relationships. And it's like, it's really hard to not be prejudiced when you don't know somebody within that group at some level.
Yeah.
And I don't know, is that how does anthropology help us answer that? Is that are we all just tribal, like just lunatics?
Well,
What's going on?
I think in-group, out-group dynamics are basic to humans. We are always categorizing ourselves. When we walk into a room, we're looking around and we're thinking, who do I want to sit next to? Who looks like they're going to be my friend?
Who's going to be in? Who's going to be out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But what we do with those dynamics is also a choice. Like, we don't have to hate people in other groups. We can admire, we can learn from, we can work together. Like, there's possible ways of being across difference. Like, you and I are different in, I don't know where you grew up, and you're a man, I'm a woman. Like, we could list so many ways we're probably different. But the fact that we have a conversation together and we are different is actually so beneficial to us, right? And so part of what racial justice involves is saying we're going to have differences. That's not going to go away in the course of humanity ever. But what we do with those differences can be better or worse. Like, we could hierarchically rank people. And that's what race is at the core, is like, it's a system for hierarchically ranking human beings. So that there was a group of people, European, white, they called themselves white at a time in history, and they had the power and the guns and the wealth and the influence to be able to say, we're going to call ourselves better, we're going to believe we're better, and we're going to create institutions that last so that we can continue to be better. Yeah. And so, like you were saying, it's costly as a white person to start to engage in that. That's because that's how the system is set up, right? It was designed, right. And like, words like white supremacy, like, are icky and scary to some people. But I'm just going to say, like, that's just talking about the way that historically people from Europe set up a system to try to keep themselves in like that supreme place of being seen as better and having more control over resources. And, if you just look at it from that basic question of like, should some humans be better than others? I think the answer is no, absolutely not. And so, but to undo that, it's going to feel
Yes.
costly for those of us who've benefited
Yes.
from it. Yeah. So, but I think it's helpful. A couple things in that is to remember that it's also costly for people of color to engage with it. Like they don't want to have to engage with it necessarily either. If you're like the one Black faculty member in a department in a college and something racist happens and you know that it could be negatively affecting, say, like the way your students view you, you already are missing out on or it's already costly to you, but it's potentially even more costly to speak up because then people are going to be like, oh, you're the angry black person, or like,
Right.
why are you making a big deal out of it? Right. And so people might look down at you even more when you engage with it. Whereas as a white person, when that happens, it didn't start out costly to me, but it's costly when I start to engage with it. But the thing to remember is like long term, it is in all of our best interest to work for breaking down that system of hierarchy and
Yes.
in-group, out-group hatred and stuff. Like none of us benefits from it in the long run.
Yeah, we definitely don't. And it's just like so fascinating to me that, you know, the power of culture to shape how we think so that you literally can be sitting next to someone who in every other way is just like you in terms of they're human, they bleed the same, they have the same, all of these different things. You can feel this intense discomfort but it is because like someone could feel that because of someone's skin color or whatever. And also, though, I think even more, it probably has to do with the cultural forces at work within even subcultures. And, you know, w- I guess I'm really trying to wrap my mind around why this is so hard.
Yeah.
Why is this so hard? Because
Yeah.
it's like I said, my parents never taught me that that white people were supreme. They never said that. I don't think I ever heard my parents say the phrase white supremacy, which they probably wouldn't have said it. But if they did say it, they would have said it in a negative way, like freaking KKK or something, white supremacist. And it's like and yet I can still have so much difference at so many areas of ignorance or whatever it is, like along the issue of race. It's amazing to me
Yeah.
that it's so hard.
It is. I know social change is really hard. I tell people like we were never meant to like fix or change society as an individual by yourself because the society is made up of like so many different little things that all fit together. And that training to like rank people is often so subtle. Here's another example of how a man described it playing out in his life. This is a white man who grew up in a white family. And when he was like 5, 6 years old, he had a friend at school who was Black. And this is, when you're a little kid, you don't know these categories. You don't necessarily even know there's names for the lighter and darker skin tones and things like that. So it was not something he was conscious of, but he went home to play at the home of this friend. And his friend, this Black friend's mom, kind of looked at him strangely about like why he was there. And then their moms, I think, ended up calling each other and talking. And basically this white man's mom called or was on the phone and is like, you need to come home right away. And he comes home and he didn't like nobody said the word because this is a Black kid, or even like didn't even mention like class differences. Poverty is also something we don't necessarily talk about, but we're very aware of it. He said afterward he remembered
Yes.
like why was there like broken glass on the road and why was there no grass along the street and like
Mm,
why did that neighborhood feel different? But almost in the silence is how he was taught about it. So sometimes like
mm.
the things that our parents don't say to us, like I grew up in a multiracial extended family, but we didn't talk about race until it like smashed us in the face when I was in college. And and
Yeah,
so sometimes
same.
the silence and the avoidance of it is also a part of what allows it to kind of continue. So that is another
Yeah.
part of like why it's hard because we actually have
We
to like talk about it.
Yeah, like one of those. So my parents, right? They again, I was never taught white supremacy, but I do understand, like in words, right? And I do I do understand what you're saying though. Like even things that my grandparents said, even things that probably were mentioned like on the side or conversations I overheard or whatever it is, right? There's this sense, right, that if not one is supreme than the other, because I never heard that, but we're different. And, we're different. And I remember, and different in a better way, right?
Mm,
So I remember my sister, she's married to a black man, one of my favorite people in the world. I love him, and my brother-in-law. And but when that first happened, I remember being shocked, and I remember feeling the tension and not knowing what it was, but kind of figuring it was about this. And then I remember my grandpa saying something really, really, really racist
mhm,
to my sister and it hurt him so bad. And I just remember hearing that and thinking like, and we were at the dinner table and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe grandpa just said that. Like that's wild. But it was real. And the older I got and looking back and the things I heard, that is what was kind of embedded in my parents. And then just by osmosis, the fact of them raising me was embedded in me. There isn't really another explanation for it, like why I would have this kind of inherent fear of black men, like when I was young, or I'd
mhm.
have this inherent fear of, or just sense that I can't be like, that culture is different than mine. Again, I was never taught that, but that feelings, the intuition, that feelings level was there. And I had to really, really, really push beyond that
Yeah.
to get to a place where I did connect with people and felt like I could connect because I wanted to, people of a different culture, because I wanted to, and because like it wasn't just a project. It was
Yeah.
because I wanted to.
Yeah.
And I think that at first, though, it might have to start as a project in some sense, in terms of intentionality, at least. Not to make someone a project, but it's like you do have to be intentional and it's going to be uncomfortable.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like I study culture as an anthropologist, right? And I feel like one of the things that anthropologists are like shouting to the world all the time is culture matters. And by that I just mean like
Culture eats strategy for breakfast.
yes.
That was just, but it
Yeah,
does.
that's a
Culture
good one.
matters.
Right, it does, yeah. It's so a part of who we are, and we don't learn it in, like, culture class in school. It's not like you
There
get
is
to
no
3rd
culture
grade and they're like, "Now we're
class.
gonna teach you what your culture is," right? You're learning it from birth, who you are
Yes.
around, who you're not around, how people talk
Yes.
to you, the little, like, unconscious things that people do, like where do they flinch, where do they look scared? It's all the little offhanded comments that's teaching you stuff. And so when you want to unlearn a view of racism, it's going to take intentionality because it's so deeply embedded in you. Yeah.
So deeply embedded.
Yeah. And
And
even like,
oh,
like you
God.
were saying about like making it a project, one of the things that can happen when white people do try to find opportunities to be like, I'm going to diversify my friend group or the people that I'm around is part of the narrative of racism that we're steeped in is like we assume that the way that we will find or relate to people of color is through like a mission trip or like volunteer on a Saturday in like poverty.
Right. Go
Yeah.
drive in, then leave. Drive in,
Yeah.
then
Right.
leave. Yeah.
And you're not actually changing that hierarchy. You're still reinforcing, like, I'm the one in control of this situation. I'm the one who gets to help, and I will decide how much I help and when I help. I had this
And when I
woman.
leave.
Yeah, and when I leave. Yeah. There's a black woman who said she's a professor, highly educated person, and she was working alongside this white woman in some kind of a project that was, related to having a high education, like and lots of skills. And she was like, what is going on with this white woman? Like, she just interacts with me strangely. And finally, she just asked her straight up, she's like, why are you so weird around me? And this white woman said, I've just never been around a black person with your credentials. When I'm around black
Hmm.
people, it's always like I go and I'm like working with people in poverty or like a project that I'm choosing to sort of be the one in control of. And if you look at studies there's a lot of research that's been done on how white people, really similar to my research, like how do white people come to address racism long term? There's this theory called contact theory that came up probably I think in the it started, and it started from some studies that were asking, like, can you just put people of different races together in the same room and have them talk together, and then will it make people less racist, or at least white people less racist? And they found that just putting people together in the same room alone, that is not necessarily enough. It can actually do more
Hmm.
harm. And a lot of people of color know this from experience. Like, I'm not just going to go to this multiracial church because I'll be the token Black person. Like, that sounds awful. I might not be
Right.
treated well there. And so you can't just put people in contact with each other. It has to be certain kinds of contact. And one of the things that has been shown to be effective over time is when white people are in subservient relationships. So if it's like my pastor over me is a person of color, or my professor or my teacher or my leader or my mentor, things like that. So really thinking about how the hierarchies play out in those relationships can be an important thing to think about too.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. It makes me think about, yeah, I mean, just how hard it is to submit ourselves to anyone.
Yes. Yeah.
And man, that's a tough thing. Just the process of submission is so hard. But I think you're right. I think it's important. You talk about hope, and I want to concentrate kind of on this last big question about the book on what is kind of our grounds for abiding hope. You talk about delusional hope. You had mentioned it before in this conversation. You brought it up. The idea of delusional hope versus abiding hope. And I guess really what grounds abide? How do you have abiding hope?
Yeah.
We need
Uh-huh.
some hope right now. So, what did you
Yeah.
discover about that essentially?
Well, it's a hope that I see it as sort of like growing out of these other three pieces we've talked about. And those pieces include being really in touch with what is wrong in the world. So it's a hope that is not in denial. It's a hope that's well aware of the struggle that we're going to have to engage in often, and with all kinds of big problems in life. I'm not talking just about racism, but like if you want to have hope for like getting over an addiction, or your children making it through a hard time in school or something, like you're going to have to be real about what you're up against. So that's part of it.
Yes.
But the way I heard people talk about it, when I'd be like, why do you hope? Sometimes people would give this very short Sunday school answer to it and be like, Jesus, please tell me
Hmm.
more, because everybody can say that. And when they talk about what they meant by that as Christians, I realize it's a particular story of what Jesus did. It's a
Hmm.
storyline. And it's a storyline that I would summarize as God interrupts the bad with the good. And you can see that as just a description of the whole storyline of creation, right? That there is nothing, there's chaos, and God creates good out of that. I don't know if you want to call the chaos bad, but God creates good out of nothing. And then, like, the
Right.
Exodus is like
Well, it
slavery
was
and
bad
good
in
out of it.
the
Yeah.
ancient view. Chaos
Yeah.
was definitely it was bad in the ancient view. So at least we can
Yeah,
say
that's
that.
helpful to hear, right? Yeah, so it's like good out of bad, and not out of like, just continuing on a trajectory that the world was on. And then like Christ coming at a time in history where like he's born in a time where his parents are like traveling, and then they have to be refugees, and he's in a stable, and then like his life is some struggle, and then he dies, and then he's dead for 3 days, and then he rises. And so like there's always this message of hope is not looking at our present circumstances and saying these data points point toward things are getting better. Like the stock market is moving up, and so I'm going to be hopeful today. It's like the
Right.
stock market might be tanking, but God still interrupts the bad with the good. Let me just read you one of my
I love
favorite
that.
quotes along these lines. This is from a Latina woman. And I asked her why she hopes. And first she says, Jesus is the center of my hope. But then she took a breath and launched into this rolling rhythm of like a preacher. And she says this, my hope is in knowing the promises that come afterwards, that we live by faith and not by sight. And we claim things that even though we don't see them yet, we're trusting. We're trusting that God is going to call people from every tribe and tongue and nation, that this will happen. My hope can't be on the leadership of my church. My hope can't be on the people at my church. My hope can't be on the politicians. My hope can't even be on myself, because we are all so fallen. My hope has to remain consistently on Jesus, who is the author, the finisher of all this. He will perfect us. We are in progress. And I love that, right? Like that's the basis of it. And so
Yes,
out
love
of
that
that
too.
grows this willingness to struggle and to walk alongside God with, it's not like you don't care about present circumstances. You see the bad, but you're also not afraid of it.
I really, really, really like that. Man, it's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you, Christine. Thank you for coming on, spending some time. It's really been awesome. How can people connect with you? And is there a preferred vendor for the book?
Yeah, you can find it anywhere you get books. It's an IVP publication, so you can find it there. You can also look up my Substack, which is called Just Learning, and follow me there. Let me say just one more little freebie, too. I mentioned
Please.
earlier that engaging with racial justice or any kind of justice is a matter of heart and soul and mind and strength.
Yes.
Together with my publisher, IVP, we put together this little tool that's kind of like a 25-question quiz. And
Nice.
at the end of it, it tells you which is your strongest area and which is an area you could grow in. So it'll help you identify, am I a person who leads from my heart when I'm trying to do justice, or my mind or soul? And it gives you
Hmm.
action steps based on each one of those. So you can find that if you just go to IVP's website and search for this book, Racial Justice for the Long Haul, and it's on the IVP website. So check that out.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Christine. And it's been awesome to have you on the show. Thank you for
Yeah.
being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And guys, we're going to put all of those links in the show notes. Make sure you can connect with Christine. Go get the book, join the Substack, do all that stuff, be a part of what's going on. Guys, thanks for tuning in and listening. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless.